Leaving as fast as they can, people fled the northeastern city of Sumy, trying to get out before nightfall when a ceasefire ends. The night before, airstrikes hit residential buildings and a power plant. Local authorities said 21 people were killed. Further west, people fleeing the city of Irpin, close to the capital Kyiv, crossing a damaged bridge that Russian troops have repeatedly fired on as civilians try to get across. Heartbreaking goodbyes as many of the men split up from their families to go back and fight. Others helping those unable to make the journey by themselves. We are fleeing. She is barely walking, but we are doing our best, thank you. It is good that we could cross the bridge. Bombs are exploding over there, quite intense. Irpin is totally damaged. Meanwhile, in the capital, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy refusing to flee. A video message to his people, trying to prepare them for the days to come. Snow is falling. This is spring. The war is the same as spring. Severe. But it will be all right. We will win anyway. Military analysts say the Russian onslaught will likely get worse in the coming days. Russian forces are increasingly turning to shelling civilian areas and infrastructure, while their tanks and troops are bogged down outside key cities. In the port city of Odessa, residents are mounting barricades in front of the beloved opera house. So far, the city hasn't been hit, but if the experience of the last several days is any guide, anyone who stays behind should be prepared for the worst.
Let's go to DW correspondent Nick Connolly, who is reporting for us from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. And Nick, the humanitarian situation around Kyiv is getting worse. Have refugees been able to get to the capital so that they can then travel on outside of Ukraine?
That definitely is happening, even though it is very difficult, and we have seen people lose their lives trying to get out of those western suburbs of Kyiv. So slightly counterintuitively, people now trying to get west to the EU, to Poland, are having to travel east out of those suburbs into Kyiv to get on a train, because the train connections, the train tracks have been destroyed around Irpin, so they're going in buses. The main highway leading west that is near Irpin is also pretty dangerous. There's been a lot of military activity along there, people hearing shots fired traveling. So basically they have to go by kind of side routes back into the capital, then head out southwesterly direction away from the fighting. We saw pretty extraordinary scenes at the train station yesterday, announcements on the loudspeaker of lost children looking for their parents, people traveling with their pets, people in wheelchairs trying to get around a station which unfortunately was overfilled with humanity, but also some of the lifts were out of service, so people trying to carry them up steps. It is an exodus. As the United Nations has said, this is the biggest refugee movement in Europe since the Second World War, so it's pretty difficult to look at and to talk to these people without feeling just kind of at a loss as what to say. But people are still making their way out, and they are still able to get out for now. Kyiv has not yet been encircled.
And can you tell us what life is like for those who have decided to stay in Kyiv?
Well, for now, in downtown Kyiv, where I am now, there's still electricity, there's still heating, there's still mobile phone networks, so that makes life bearable. And there are definitely more people here than you would think. If you walk around the streets, pretty empty, apart from journalists and soldiers and the occasional person walking a dog or going to the supermarket. We were out in the suburbs today, not far from Irpin, slightly further south, in an area where the local territorial defense forces are preparing for a Russian onslaught, where they've blown up bridges, where they have tried to kind of block the roads in a way to prevent tanks moving across. They're pretty worried that the Russians are going to build pontoon bridges and try and overwhelm their attempts to stop this happening. But it was kind of extraordinary just to see the kind of range of people now in uniform bearing arms. You had someone who usually takes high school kids on mountain hiking trips. You had IT people, you had people who work managing supermarkets. All these people are now suddenly in boots, in uniforms, with a gun on their shoulder at checkpoints, trying to look for Russian sleeper agents or to stop looting happening. And it's kind of extraordinary scene to people who in normal life have never come across each other, now suddenly united by this danger to their homes.
And Ukrainian President Zelenskyy is continuing his efforts to shore up support from Western countries. How optimistic is he that his demands are being met?
Well, certainly the sanctions against Russia in the last few weeks have been unprecedented. I think they definitely took the Russian leadership by surprise, especially the freezing of those Russian central bank assets. So basically that war chest that Russia had built up over the previous years, especially for a case like this, to basically kind of cushion the effect of sanctions, that was basically made useless by those freezing sanctions from Western banks. I think, though, that the real crunch now will be if Western countries that say they support Ukraine's democracy, are they really willing to pay an economic price for this? Are they willing to pay a lot more for energy by not buying Russian oil and gas? Are they willing to go there? Are they willing to risk further confrontation with Russia? Russia has basically threatened the West with nuclear war in recent days, and we've seen lots of Western governments kind of rowing back on their promises of support for Ukraine. So there's a real worry here in Kiev whether these Western countries are actually going to make good on those promises and be willing to pay a price to support Ukraine.
DW correspondent Nick Connolly, thank you so much for your reporting from Kyiv. Let's go now to Pavel Felgenhauer, a Moscow-based military analyst. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. I want to ask you, almost 2 weeks into the war, and we are seeing Russia's territorial gains, especially in the south and east of the country, whereas in the north and around Kyiv, the operation seems to not be going at full speed. Can you tell us why that is?
Well, the Russian offensive reached a kind of crescent. Actually, it's stopped all over the place. Russia still has the initiative. It's trying to push in different directions. In Izium, that's trying to close in from the other side into the Lugansk Oblast. And also in the south, there's still offensive action, but there it's also kind of right now stopped. The Russian offensive has ran out of steam.
And what are we to make of that?
That's a serious problem. Well, that's because Russia doesn't have apparently sufficient reserves. Russia threw into battle more or less what it could. Russia right now has a rather big regular standing army. We didn't have such an army since the Crimean War in the mid-19th century. It's an army that can go into war without mobilization of reserves. The official figure, the last official figure that appeared in last August, it was Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, who said that we have 168 permanent ready battalion tactical groups. That's a lot. NATO deployed against Russia 4 tactical battalion groups, one in each Baltic state and one in Poland, so Russia has more, and over 100 went into Ukraine. So Russia kind of theoretically still has, I don't know, 40, 60, 50 left, no, 50 maybe, but it can't send them all in. You have to keep garrisons in the Kuril Islands, in Chukotka, and many, in Kaliningrad, of course, against the Baltic states, and against Poland and Belarus. So that means Russia has run out of reserves. Because officially we have reserves, but actually they're not reserves. They're just on paper, because these were people who served 1 year in the armed forces compulsory and were never called up for retraining. If you even call them in, that would mean they have to train them for at least 3 months, maybe more, before you can send them into battle.
Right.
And
but given the resources that Ukraine has, sorry, I just want to jump in, because also from Ukraine's side, how long do you think Kyiv can realistically keep up its resistance against this?
Well, the thing is, for the Russian problem is that Ukraine began a mobilization. Officially, it's full mobilization of the reserve, and they have a lot of reservists who served in the 8 years of the conflict in the Donbass against the Russians. And they're calling them up. There's also volunteers of the territorial defense. So Russian frontline positions and Russian frontline forces are more or less static, and they are even getting weaker as the attrition continues. While Ukrainians are getting stronger day by day. Reservists are called up. The Ukrainian army stopped the Russian offensive. They didn't capture that much territory, so Ukraine controls the territory. They have their line, their chain of command is intact. Organized resistance continues, and they're organizing mobilization. They didn't do it before the war.
I'm sorry to jump in, but we do have to leave the interview there. I want to thank you again for coming on to DW News. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has addressed British members of parliament in the House of Commons in London. Zelenskyy received a standing ovation from MPs as he spoke to them via a video link from Kyiv, where he remains despite increasing Russian pressure on the capital. And we spoke about the hardships endured by civilians, but said his people would fight to ensure they do not lose their country. The Ukrainian leader appealed to Britain and the West to do more to help his country.
Please increase the pressure of sanctions against this country, and please recognize this country as a terrorist state. And please make sure that our Ukrainian skies are safe. Please make sure that you do what needs to be done and what is stipulated by the greatness of your country.
And let's bring in DW correspondent Charlotte Chelsom-Pill in London for more. Charlotte, what stood out to you about Zelensky's speech to lawmakers?
Well, it was an extremely emotive speech that was given earlier this evening. He really day by day went through what 13 days of war have meant for Ukraine, some of the horrors that he described having been endured, saying that this was a war that he did not start. Now, he compared Ukraine's fight to the British fight against the Nazis in the Second World War, and in doing so, he echoed comments made by former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill during that Second War in a very famous speech that will be known to the British public and many around the world. He was saying, we will not give up, we will fight whatever the costs in the forests, the fields, the shores and the streets. He also quoted William Shakespeare in this speech too. He said the question that's faced Ukraine is to be or not to be, and he said tonight he can say Ukraine will be. He also addressed the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson directly. He asked for even more sanctions to be imposed, and he also asked that the Ukrainian skies are kept safe, a reference there to his repeated plea for a no-fly zone, something that the UK, alongside many others, has repeatedly defied.
So he clearly knows his audience there. What has the reaction been to his address?
There was a standing ovation from parliamentarians both before and after that speech, absolutely packed house. And just to really stress the significance of this is the first time that a foreign leader, albeit virtually, has addressed the House of Commons in that chamber like this. So people have been describing it here as a historic moment. Prime Minister Boris Johnson immediately afterwards responded. He said, never has the House listened to such an address. He said it's moved the hearts of everyone in this House. He stressed that the UK is determined to press on to tighten the pressure on Russia.
All right, thank you very much for that. Charlotte Chelsom-Pill, our correspondent in London. Let's go to the United States now, where President Joe Biden has announced a ban on imports of Russian oil into the country. He said Americans don't want to subsidize Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine, despite rising costs at the gas station.
Today, I'm announcing the United States is targeting the main artery of Russia's economy. We're banning all imports of Russian oil and gas and energy. That means Russian oil will no longer be acceptable at U.S. ports, and the American people will deal another powerful blow to Putin's war machine. This is a move that has strong bipartisan support in Congress and, I believe, in the country.
So for more, I'm joined by DW's economic journalist, Chelsea Delaney. Hi, Chelsea. So the U.S. has banned imports of Russian oil to put pressure on Putin. What are the chances that European countries are going to follow suit?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that the U.S. and Europe are really in very different positions here. The U.S. imported about 3% of the U.S.'s oil imports last year were from Russia. And the EU, that's 27%. So the EU is drastically more dependent on Russian oil, also Russian gas. So they're obviously much more reluctant to actually get to go forward with this. And we saw this from Biden in his announcement today. He said that we recognize that not all of our allies and partners are in a position to join us. So he does sort of know that Europe is in a different position. I think it does put more pressure on the EU to speed up their acceleration of getting rid of Russian oil and gas. But for now, what we've heard from leaders here, in Germany, Annalena Baerbock saying today, the foreign minister, that this would bring transport to a halt. So there's still a lot of reluctance in Europe to pull that lever.
Right. So given those quite severe potential consequences, are there other countries that are in a position to step up and replace the energy needs that Russia has been supplying?
Yeah, that's a huge question. Russia, obviously, one of the biggest suppliers of oil and gas in the world. Everyone's asking now who can do that, who can fill that gap. Really, there isn't enough oil, there isn't enough gas out there to do that, is what analysts are saying. There are other countries that could increase oil production. Of course, we have the OPEC Plus Global Oil Alliance. Countries like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates do have potential to increase oil production. But I think what we've seen on the market, it shows us that there really isn't enough oil out there. We've seen prices, up to $130 a barrel. Also in the gas market, it's going to be extremely difficult for gas suppliers to increase their production, particularly here in the EU. We get most of our gas from pipelines. There is the potential to get LNG, liquefied natural gas, from ships, but countries like Qatar and the U.S. are trying to increase the production, but it's a very slow process. So that's why we're seeing the EU really put forward these plans to reduce their dependency on Russian energy, but they're saying it's going to take really until 2030 until they're fully able to get that out of the mix.
And if you can, put this into lay terms. What is a normal person going about their daily life going to experience as a result of this?
Yeah, it has huge implications. Energy prices are not abstract. We feel them all in our daily lives. For people who drive cars, already this is having a huge impact. Here in Europe, we've seen gas prices, petrol prices rise above $8 in some places. In the U.S., it's above $4. These are all new records. We're really in uncharted territory. And also you have to remember that we came into this year already seeing inflation at multi-decade highs. So that's definitely going to add to those problems. As well, you have electricity prices, heating prices really going to skyrocket for a lot of households. So, of course, this is going to hit the most vulnerable the hardest.
All right, DW's Chelsea Delaney, thank you so much for joining me in the studio with that update.